As voted for by members on YouTube and Patreon, we have how to pair your heroes in multiplayer, which I'm very excited to talk about. So we're going to start with an example. Spider-Man, Peter Parker, somebody wants to play them. You want to play one of these other four X-Men. Which one is going to be the best choice? Now, for my money, there are two really good choices, one pretty good choice, and one maybe not so good choice. And I'm not going to tell you guys, or at least not right now. My goal is that by the end of the video, I will have taught you how to figure that out for yourself, but we're probably going to go through it then just so you can see the things we're talking about here in the video in action. So, I'm Villain Fury and let's get into it. So firstly, there are three different ways you can pair your characters. The first one is theme. Read a comic book, watch a movie, see who you think would be fun together based on story and who would actually work together. The second one is feeling. Player 1 thinks, I feel like playing this character. Player 2 says, I feel like playing this one. You can do that and try and make them come together completely fine. The third one is mechanics, and these are picking heroes based on mechanical properties that make them suited to each other. Maybe they cover each other's weaknesses, maybe they elevate each other's strengths, maybe they have this one card that works in a funny way with this other character's card that's really cool to see, and it's all that kind of thing that we're talking about here today. So I'm going to go into a big video on all the different kind of things you can take into account here, but if you just want a very simple way to pair up heroes, and this is mainly for two-player, though you can kind of take the principle elsewhere. We have the quick and easy method, which you might have already read by now. It's on the screen. Someone chooses a hero. You've got to figure out what that hero's biggest weakness is. And for a lot of characters, this might be low threat removal. For other characters, they're a bit slow to get going. Those are the two most common weaknesses, I would say. And then you pair them with a hero who has that weakness as a strength. So let's say Hulk is low thwarting. You just pair Hulk with a character that has a lot of thwarting, like Vision. Let's say you have a slow setup character like Iron Man, maybe you pair them with a fast setup character that can do a lot in the early game, like perhaps Nova, and that will work really well because the downside of that character has been completely countered by the upsides of another character, and that will make for smooth games in most circumstances. Now, let's say you want to play two characters with the same weakness, you're really set on it. What can you do? Well, for the most part, you can fix it with aspects, and this means even with our Peter Parker example, that there aren't really any bad pairings, there are just some that are maybe better than others. So here we've got Colossus and She-Hulk, low threat removal heroes. Well, we have Justice, which is the threat removal aspect, and Leadership, which is the kind of all-rounder aspect that can do quite good threat removal as well. You can take these high damage, low threat removal characters, put one into Justice, one into Leadership, and it will pretty much balance things out. Now, while this is fine and does work well, part of the video here is more about how you can elevate your characters. So rather than set yourself up with a weakness that you're kind of hurrying to try and cover up, it's sometimes better to make sure the foundation of the two heroes is already pretty balanced out and covering for any weak spots, and then build on top of it and then go all into the positive. But this will work fine. The alternative is, and this is particularly with low thwarting, high damage characters, is you can just go for a rush strategy. That is completely fine here. Don't worry about threat removal. Just try and defeat the villain before they defeat you in a hurry. And not my favorite way to play personally, but it can be fun and it can work out well for pairings like this. And now we're into the meat of the video here. So if we just looked at the basics, you could think of attributes as being maybe the kind of middle intermediate ground, and specifics kind of being the advanced stuff. So what do I mean by attributes? Well, if you've seen my videos before, you've probably seen something a little bit like this, where I rate characters over 8 different categories. Some are more important than others, some are more obvious than others in what they mean, but don't worry, we'll be going over all of that here. In terms of pairing up one hero with another hero, some of these attributes are worth more than others. I've already talked about threat removal, and that's a big one. So let's put these in order of priority, I would say, especially for this video that we're going to talk about these. So we've got threat removal up first, then speed of setup. I've already touched on threat removal a little bit, but it is the most common weakness, and more than that, it is the thing in multiplayer that scales up the most. On the left here, you can see a main scheme. It goes up by 1 per player. You can see that at the bottom. And in 4-player, that's going to be going up by 4 per turn, as opposed to 1 per turn in solo. And I know what you're thinking, but Villain Fury, there are 4 players. Other people can help out with that extra threat per turn. And you're right, this is not a huge deal, though it is worth considering. What is a bigger deal is that with 4 players, and I'm using 4 players here just to demonstrate things on the most extreme level, this is still relevant at 2 players as well, but 4 players, you have 4 times the amount of encounter cards, which basically means you're 4 times as likely to get a side scheme, and side schemes also have a lot of threat that often needs dealing with. And this gets worse because most side schemes scale up in threat as well. So you're 4 times more likely to get a side scheme, and that side scheme might scale up 4 times as much in threat. And that's some scary maths. So If I get Invasive AI here, which is an encounter card that Ultron has as my encounter card, it's going to have 12 threat on it. If I draw this in solo, it's only going to have 3 threat on it. So I'm 4 times more likely to get this just massive amount of threat to appear out of nowhere, which makes side schemes very scary things to get in multiplayer. Now, the final point here is that the main scheme typically has the threat threshold multiplied by the amount of players. So in solo, this main scheme here has 10 threat per person. In 2-player, 20. In 4-player, it'll be 40 threat overall. So what that means is that in multiplayer, it's much safer to flip Alter Ego, as it's much less swingy. The villain won't just scheme and fill the whole thing up. It will give you a lot more breathing room. However, making more use of Alter Ego, while good, means more threat overall is going to be added on. You're going to be putting more advances as well and things like that. So it's very easy in multiplayer to think, oh, I can go Alter Ego with no risk. Go Alter Ego, but then there's tons of threat on the main scheme and nobody's prepared to remove that amount of threat from it. And you find you use it early on for a break from damage or to get some extra cards, but then you haven't got a way to bring it down. Make sure you bring the threat removal, because the ability to lean into going Alter Ego safely is so good. If you can go Alter Ego safely, you dodge attacks, you can use your recovery. It basically covers a lot of your survivability if you can cover the threat removal. Here's a few examples of characters with low and high threat removal that will pair together really well, and I'm not going to go over every one here, but if you guys want to, you can pause the video, have a look, and get some ideas of what you can do. Next up, we have speed of setup, which I've touched on slightly, but this is another common weakness. Some characters take several turns to get going, and in multiplayer, where some encounter cards target different people, or things like teamwork exists, which means minions are going to activate extra times if they enter play when somebody else has a teamwork minion already out. Just things can go very wrong in multiplayer if a lot of players are moving very slowly. The whole kind of tide can turn against them, and it can be hard to shift that back. So the best thing to do is, if you have a character with slow setup, is take a character with fast setup to counteract that. And this kind of has some extra benefits here. And I should say, 2 characters with average setup speed that kind of, play at an average pace, completely fine. But the characters with the slowest setup tend to do extremely well later on. They tend to start very weak, but end as some of the most powerful characters in the game. So if you can bring one of those along in multiplayer, and just make sure the 1, 2, or 3 other players can give them time to build up and become strong, the rewards can be almost, exponential. They can be greater than the weakness you have to offset. So we can have a character like Iron Man, and I'm sure you guys have seen the movies. The villains come around and, oh, I've got to put my suit on, and that's basically how it is for a lot of the slowest setup characters in Marvel Champions. And they might not do too much for a couple of turns. I'd think of them as doing maybe half as much as a fast-paced character. And then you've got the fast-paced character, or maybe multiple, or, in 4-player, you could have a slow character, 2 average, and a fast, whatever works for your group. But let's say it's 2-player, you've got that slow character, and you've got a fast character, rushing around to take care of both the problems for both of you, whether that's the encounter cards that just came in, maybe you both started with their minion out, that's maybe part of the scenario, but that fast player is just trying to keep things afloat, put out all the fires, keep things clear as best they can, while the slow player is building up. Then a few turns into the game, things will switch around. For some characters, this might be turn 2 or 3. Other characters, maybe with slower decks too, maybe 4 or 5. But regardless, there will come a point where the slow character is powered up, and they'll start to easily carry the middle of the game and the late game. Characters like Iron Man, Ironheart, they have so much output once they're set up, leveled up, and ready to go. It's kind of terrifying. And then you've got the fast character who continue to help where they can, and they will still do well, but whereas the slow character was doing half as much originally, now maybe the fast character is doing half as much as that built-up slow character who is now just devastating the board. So I put they'll be carried over the finish line here, which is slightly true, but they're not necessarily being carried as such in terms of the other player having to pick up the slack, but the other player, the slow player who's built up, will just be doing so much, it will basically be taking care of the game by itself sometimes. Now, there are some pros and cons here, because sometimes the faster player can feel like they're just having to, do board control, and then the late game player will come and steal the glory. But the way I would like to look at it is that the fast player, the fast-paced character, is kind of the early game champion who's doing all the hard work there. And then in the late game, the slow character is doing all the hard work there. It's a champion there. So one character gets to relax early on, and the other character gets to relax later. And it is a 50-50 teamwork. It's important to remember that the slow character is only that strong because the fast character was able to help them. Now, 2 slow characters can be fine, just like a slow character can be fine in solo play, but it's not ideal, which is kind of what we're talking about here. I've got some examples here on the screen for you, so feel free to pause and have a look at that. These characters all work pretty well together overall, I think. And yeah, let's move on to the next topic. Moving down to the second tier of attributes that I value, we've got survivability and damage. And you might be thinking these maybe should be higher up, but here's the thing. Most characters can survive just fine, even if they have to put in a lot of status cards, which are more common than ever. Even if they have to put in a bunch of allies, which we have more choice of than ever, they have tools to survive. So it's least necessary in multiplayer, but nonetheless, it's still very good to have, especially with some of the squishiest characters. The best thing I would say defensive, strength does in the game is if you can help other players defend and keep them healthy, they can dedicate more resources to their game plan. So a character like Gamora has 2 defense. She has 2 defense cards. Her alter ego is pretty decent. She can heal. She doesn't have a super low survivability, but she really wants to be putting her resources into events. So if a character like Captain America can defend for her, she can just get more going. Some examples here of low survivability are on the left, and some examples of very high survivability are here on the right, and they can make really good pairings. And honestly, there are not many characters that I consider having really low survivability. So I bet some people in the comments will be arguing that Gamora and Phoenix aren't that bad off in terms of, preventing losses through damage. And while you're right, I do think they are a lot lower than average. Now we get to talk about damage, and everybody loves damage. But here's the thing, there are no low damage characters in Marvel Champions, and I know what you're thinking, but Villain Theory, objectively somebody has to have the lowest damage output, and you're right, but if we compare the lowest threat removal characters to the highest threat removal characters, and then the lowest damage characters to the highest damage characters, the threat removal characters will maybe have a gap from the highest to the lowest, and then the damage characters will probably be more like highest to lowest, the gap is just less. Every character can do pretty decent damage. What I think is more important when pairing heroes in Marvel Champions, and okay, it is important maybe for some of the lowest damage characters to have maybe someone to help out with maybe getting overrun by minions early on and things, but the main thing I think is the difference in damage sizes. Let's have an example here. Spider-Man Peter Parker swinging web kick does 8 damage. Great. What other attack cards does he have? None. He's either dealing 8 damage or he's finding 1 or 2 damage from his basic activation and signature ally, so he's really very bad at medium-sized amounts of damage, which is the best kind of size for most minions. Let's contrast this with Nova, who has the Potshot attack card. That's his only attack card, and that just deals 4 damage. So Potshot is really good for defeating minions, but if Nova wants to, say, defeat the villain or a big minion, just having Potshot in hand probably not going to give him the mileage he needs to achieve that. So pairing Nova and Spider-Man together can be a really good idea. Spider-Man can take out any of the bigger minions pretty cleanly, or he can just focus on hitting the villain when it's time to do that, while Nova can probably help clear the board on medium-sized minions a lot better. On the other hand, we have characters like Wolverine, which can do basically however much damage they want, whenever, in different amounts, and yeah, if you have a character like Wolverine on your team, you don't really have to worry about what anyone else is bringing in terms of damage size too much. Here we have some examples of low damage characters and high damage characters, and I say low damage with, an asterisk. They are medium damage, and I've even had to put Miss Marvel on here because it's really hard to find 5 characters that I consider to have low damage. Miss Marvel's attack card isn't that efficient. If you don't have Embiggen out, it's not that great. If you're not in aggression, but she can still have really good damage. You build her into it, and she can be a really good multiplayer minion clearer. So, damage is often covered for you in multiplayer, but still, it is good to take into account. On to the third tier of attributes, and we now have control. It's the only one I've got here, and control basically means the ability to stop the villain doing what they want. I include stuns and confuses, which also kind of factor into survivability and threat removal. They kind of overlap, but also things like cancelling encounter cards or stopping boost effects, and these are pretty rare in supply, so I wouldn't worry too much, at least, encounter card cancels and boost card cancels. But status cards are very interesting, and in a world with lots of steady and stalwart villains, I don't think you really need to consider control as something you need to build into too much, but you can have too much of it, which is my main point I want to make here. You can have what I like to call status card traffic jams, where somebody wants to put status cards onto the villain, and then somebody else does because it's, they're typically very efficient cards, and you cannot have more than one confuse or stun on the villain at one time. You can have one of each, but you cannot have 2 stuns or 2 confuses unless, the villain is steady, but, for the most part, you want to be careful to not have too much at once. So if I'm playing Spider-Woman alongside Miles Morales, you might already find situations where one of them has to sacrifice playing one of their good cards, or except they'll get less good value from it because somebody else has played one of theirs. You definitely probably don't want to start building into it in the aspect, Don't bring a Confuse Lock deck along to 2-player if somebody's already playing Psylocke at the table, because you will probably just have too many Confuses. Psylocke will start to lose some value there, although I do think Psylocke can actually be pretty good even against stalwart villains. She is not reliant on Confuses, but she definitely gets better value when she's able to do them. Last but not least, we have the final tier of attributes, and I've put 3 in here, and they are simultaneously the 3 least important attributes to pairing heroes, but maybe the 3 most important attributes in the game. That's debatable. I definitely think we could talk about that a lot. But what reliability, economy, and card value kind of equal when combined is power. So reliability is kind of consistency. If I have a hand of cards, can I play all of them? Are they all useful? Will I have a good result? What about if I play 10 games of Marvel Champions? Will I have 5 good games and 5 bad games? Or can I expect this character to have 10 pretty good games where they're hitting the expected power level every time? Economy is kind of how many cards you can play in a turn. Kind of how many cards can you pay for? So you have things like resource generators, resource cards, cost discounters. I think Helicarrier is the most common one, but in terms of heroes, I know Miss Marvel has a persona support with that kind of thing on. And lastly, and maybe most powerfully, we have card draw. If you have more cards, every card is a resource. You can pay for more things, but you can also play that card instead, which might make your hand work out more smoothly and let you play everything. Make sure you've got no resources wasted. So that's very, very good. And the last thing I want to talk about here is card value, which is how much value your cards have per resource kind of thing. Also includes how good your signature, like identity card is. But let's say I have a 2-cost card that does 6 damage, and then another hero has a 2-cost card that does 4 damage. Well, the 6-cost card is just more efficient because you're paying the same amount, but you're getting more from it. Not every hero's cards are made equally. And if you have cards which get you more bang for your buck, and you have more bucks to pay for them, and you can do this reliably, that character just tends to be more powerful. And this video isn't really about power whatsoever. I want to focus on having characters that complement one another in terms of specific things that help them, rather than, oh, this character should be paired with this character because this other character is really good and just going to do everything for them. Well, that's not fun. But it is still important to talk about when you're pairing characters, because what if somebody goes for a character that's maybe a little bit lower on these 3 categories, and somebody else goes for one that's extremely high on them? It can lead to a big feeling of imbalance. Thanos would not be happy. Things would not be perfectly balanced, and this can affect players as well. If you're playing a very, let's say, a low power character, and someone's playing a very high power character and or deck, you can kind of feel like you're lagging behind, like you're holding the team back, or like, you're just getting to do less things than them. It's not a fun feeling. But on the flip side, it can kind of be bad if you're doing tons more than another player. You might feel a little bit bad for them. You might feel like you're taking up more of the time, because typically if you're playing more cards, the turn is taking longer, and there are some things to take into account here. For my money, it's most fun to play characters that are roughly around the same power level. And I know power level is quite hotly debated. Some people love tier lists, some people hate them. How you value different power and different heroes is up to you. Maybe you feel like every character is perfectly balanced, which I would say is mathematically impossible for basically every game in existence, though certainly some are closer than others. This game does a pretty good job of it overall, but if you play a character that is generally considered to be in the top 10, and a character that is generally considered to be bottom 5, you are going to feel a world of difference. Now, maybe a character that's sort of middle of the pack and a lower character completely fine, or middle of the pack and higher up completely fine, but it is something to keep in mind. Now, some players might kind of know what they're getting into. Somebody might say, I'm going to play this weaker character, so feel free to go for a couple of stronger ones, and they've kind of accepted that beforehand. Everybody should hopefully be okay with that. Or vice versa. If somebody says, I'd really like to play Doctor Strange, so, if you guys want to go weaker characters, don't worry about it. And if people are fine accepting that, that's all good. So there's kind of a social element to this and how players are going to feel about different things, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And like I say, I think going for characters of a similar power can sometimes be the most fun option, but definitely you don't want to limit yourself too much to it, because some characters do have really interesting interactions, even if they're typically considered on maybe different ends of the power list. That does it for attributes, what I'm calling the kind of bigger picture, the kind of broad strokes. And now we're going to look at specifics, which is the slightly smaller choices. And some of these I'll spend just, maybe 10, 20 seconds on. Other ones will be a bit more in depth, but let's get into it. Up first, we have aspect choice, and I already talked a little bit earlier on about how, let's say you pick 2 characters with low threat removal, you can kind of fix that low threat removal by picking the right aspects to counteract that. But what if you have 2 characters that kind of have everything covered just from their hero kits alone, you have a really good balance? Surely then you can just put them to any aspect, right? Well, yes and no. So you can put them both into protection, and against most villains, you probably would do pretty decently, but you might do less well than if you had gone for any other possible aspect combo you could have chosen. Because, for example, with the ones on the screen, Spider-Man and Captain America are already very tanky characters, very high survivability. They don't lose to damage very easily. Now, if you put them both in protection, which helps them out with losing to damage even less, then you might find you have a bit less falling and damage than you would have liked. The game will go a bit slower. If you do still win, it probably took you 2, maybe even 3 extra turns compared to if one of you had gone leadership or something like that, or if you had gone aggression and justice. So while you might still be able to do well with the quote-unquote wrong aspects, you'd probably do better if you took something more complementary. And I'm not going to go too much into what aspects work well together here. I actually have a whole video of that earlier in this kind of video series I did called How to Pair the Aspects in 2, 3, and 4 player. And I also have a video where I've rated every character's best aspects at every player count. So I'd recommend using those videos to help you if you need it, in addition to your own game experience and knowledge. Now we're on to playstyles, and I think a very common playstyle would be characters who like to flip alter ego a lot. Now most characters can really enjoy going alter ego, but some want to do it almost every single turn, and they get a big boost there. And this is kind of something we cannot measure in attributes or anything, but it's still very relevant to gameplay. So we have characters like She-Hulk, which have a increased hand size by 2 in alter ego, which is a big gain in power, but also they have benefits when they flip back down to hero form. She-Hulk gets to do damage, Colossus gets a tough card. These are huge benefits. Black Widow, Domino, they have these really good alter ego abilities and supports and things that really benefit them, so you kind of want to do it. So what does this mean for pairing heroes? Well, if more characters are going alter ego more often, it might dictate more threat removal or threat prevention, things like confuses, and you can have 2 characters that both like to flip a lot, and you just alternate. One goes alter ego one turn, and one goes the other turn. And this can be a really powerful strategy in general, not just with these characters that get the most out of going alter ego. And all you need to do is account for it in deck building. And even if things get out of sync, you can do things like have justice, have under surveillance, and then in 2-player, 2 characters can typically go alter ego in complete safety, as long as you are keeping on top of the threat and confusing. It's pretty consistent if you build into it. And I'll just throw it in here. If you're playing 3 and 4 player and you're ending the turn and nobody is alter ego, something has probably gone wrong. Unless you're playing a very low threat removal team, then you might not want to lean into doing that. But typically, I think characters want to have enough threat removal to deal with that, and then want to have someone going alter ego to get all the benefits. I think that typically works out really well. The next playstyle I want to talk about is finishing blows. Some characters just like to get the last hit on minions because they get some kind of benefit. Valkyrie's whole kit is built around that. Rocket Raccoon gets to draw more cards. Ironheart gets more progress counters if her attack card defeats a minion. Don't bring these characters to the table together is my opinion, or you will end up fighting over minions. This can get even worse if you have another character that typically doesn't care about getting the last hit on a minion, but they're playing an aggression deck which absolutely does want that as well, and suddenly there might not be enough minions to go around. This is less of a problem in scenarios with a lot of minions, such as Mutagen Formula, but even then, if you have, let's say, Rocket Raccoon in aggression, yeah, you probably just cannot have enough minions for him. Another playstyle I want to touch on quickly are characters that kind of want to be attacked. Spider-Man hates the villain being stunned for him because then he doesn't draw a card. It effectively makes that stun a lot less valuable. It kind of artificially adds on an extra cost to it. Drax wants to get hit to get vengeance counters. Once he has those, he gets to draw a card. So typically, blocking attacks for him is a little bit less valuable as well. Then you've got Bishop, who has the ability to get resources from his energy absorption response when he's attacked and damaged, but also his uniform gives him tons of healing. So if Bishop is defended for or a stun stops him getting hit, he can actually lose out a lot. So be wary of pairing these characters with characters that want to stun or defend for other people. Lastly, I want to talk about Unstoppable Force. There are other playstyles, but there's only so much time in a given video. These are characters that want to deal damage basically every turn. And there are a lot of high damage characters that kind of maybe want to, but these are characters that I think if they don't deal damage, they are kind of losing out on basically the entire reason for bringing them along, more or less. Deadpool maybe has some funny builds with, Yoo-Hoo and Overwatch, are good, but he's still going to have a lot of turns where he'll just be able to have his 18 damage combo, and that's probably going to outweigh a lot of the other things he could possibly do. Wolverine kind of always wants to use his claws. Hulk basically only has damage, and if the team needs him to do something that isn't damage, it's just going to be a lot less value. What this kind of means is I like to think of these characters as, I don't know, something like a boulder from Indiana Jones just rolling unstoppably, and the team has to kind of accept that, build around that, play around that, because if you start to force these characters to try and play around the rest of the team, they're going to lose value. I almost think of it as like they are monster trucks or like a bulldozer just crashing through, and then the other player or players are kind of having to put out the fires left in their wake or get ahead of them, get rid of the obstacles in their way. It's a little bit like how a slow character can really enjoy a fast character to cover the early game for them. These high damage characters that really want to damage every turn can really appreciate someone to just keep the other things clear as best as possible while they do their own thing. We're going to quickly touch on team up cards here. This probably needs its own video rating each of them, but some of them are very good. Some of them, maybe not so good, but they are very fun to play around with. So if you are not sure who to pair a character up with, but they have a team up card, it can be fun to lean into that and pick the appropriate character to make that happen. And yeah, not going to touch on this too much. Just be aware that picking a character that has a team up card with the other character doesn't mean you can forget everything else. Traits is probably the biggest topic we're going to talk about here. It's very, very important. You can do a lot with it. And let's start off with what I'm calling unique avoidance. So if you played early on in Marvel Champions, almost every character in the game was an Avenger. And basically all of them wanted Quinn Carrier, which is something only Avengers can play. But it has a unique symbol, which is that little star next to its name, meaning only one of them can be out on the table at once. So yeah, players would have to fight over who got that Quinn Carrier. Fast forward to modern times, and it's a generally best practice to have different players pick different heroes from different factions, different traits. So have one Avenger character, they can have the Quinn Carrier. Maybe you have a Guardian character, they can then have Gamora, who is typically the most fought over Guardian card. She's very, very strong. And then, you have Web Warriors with a character like Spider-Man Peter Parker. That ally is phenomenally powerful. And if you have multiple Web Warriors, whoever has Spider-Man out on the table is going to get a massive boost. Whereas whoever doesn't have that Spider-Man basic Peter Parker ally on the table is going to be losing out. So splitting up your traits in a group can really let everybody take the best cards for that character without fighting over them. On the flip side, however, we have trait combos, which is where having the same traits on the table can actually lead to benefits. The most obvious one, the original one, I would say, is Avengers Assemble. So this is a 4-cost card which has an action that readies each Avenger character you control. This only helps the player who plays it. And this does include their hero and allies, so it's very, very useful in that regard. But it says, until the end of the phase, each Avenger character in play gets +1 forwarding, +1 attack. This means everyone at the table who is an Avenger, including other people's allies, will get this benefit. So let's say I'm playing Captain Marvel, and I play Avengers Assemble. Great, I can use all my allies again, and myself and my allies have a big stat boost. Also, if I've got Captain America, maybe with an aggression deck, maybe with lots of aggression Avenger allies, they all get a stat boost. That's very, very fun and pretty powerful in all honesty. This is a great card to end the game or deal with a bad villain phase afterwards. If you've got loads of stuff out on the table, somebody pours Shadow of the Past, that kind of thing. In a very similar manner, we have Blaze of Glory, which is the Guardian kind of global table stat boost, which can also be really good for ending games or clearing the board if you have kind of got overwhelmed. And then you have the X-Men as well as another consideration. They typically have a lot of supports, particularly alter ego supports, which anybody can trigger or benefit from. We have things like Moira, Danger Room, X-Mansion. So making sure somebody wants to flip down every turn who has a mutant trait or sometimes X-Men trait can be really, really useful and powerful. Next up, I wanted to talk about honorary antics, which I won't dwell on for a long time because it's a bit more niche, but it is very fun. Here's an example. I'm playing Quicksilver in Justice. I've paired with Colossus in Protection. As Quicksilver, I can play Honorary Avenger on Colossus. Now Colossus can play Muster Courage, which in Expert mode is an extremely efficient card to give out tough status cards. And Colossus loves tough status cards, so enabling him to play that card can be very, very fun. Again, we could say I'm Quicksilver, but I'm playing alongside Star-Lord. Star-Lord can put Honorary Guardian on me and then play Blaze of Glory to boost up my stats as Quicksilver. Since I ready up a lot, I get a lot of benefit from that. So there are a few fun niche combos you can do with this that are maybe something to kind of decide on first, like, oh, I want to try out this cool combo, let's pick some characters to do that, but nonetheless fun to talk about and consider. In a similar vein, we have alliance cards, which are kind of niche. They're typically not costed super well, but I actually like the leadership card, and the justice card, particularly in some scenarios, is extremely powerful, but you have to build into these things. The leadership card typically asks for somebody to have lots of expensive Avenger allies, typically in leadership, and then a Guardian player to have lots of Guardian allies, but joining forces is a very efficient way to play them. Problem Solvers, again, wants an Avenger ally and a Guardian ally, though it can be heroes as well, that can work well, and you want to get them with as high forwarding as you can. Then you play Problem Solvers, and you basically just wipe all the threat off the board. Really good against like Venom Goblin, Tower Defense, Unus, Apocalypse, and Sabanur. Scenarios which have multiple side schemes out from the start, basically permanently, this can be really powerful against those. We also have some alliance cards which don't really function around traits, but I didn't have a good other point to talk about them in this video. We have very few right now. I'm hoping we get more, but you can also just keep in mind how those work and then take that into account in either picking heroes or building your decks together. Break Time is one of the two we have. This is a pool card, so a little bit niche, but it's really good at healing characters. The more damage taken, also known as the more health you originally had, the more value you will get out of playing Break Time. I'm only going to talk about Nemesis sets briefly, but some Nemesis sets for one character, like Ant-Man, who brings in Tech Theft as his Nemesis side scheme, function very badly with certain other heroes. Let's say Iron Man, who's all about tech cards. If Tech Theft from Ant-Man's Nemesis set blanks everything Iron Man has, it can be a big problem for him. Fortunately, the amount of threat on it isn't too difficult to deal with, but this is just an example of that kind of thing happening. Colossus really likes to keep hold of his Tufts. There are some Nemesis sets which, ping out damage. Colossus won't like those. So it can just be worth avoiding pairing characters if the other character's Nemesis set really messes up the other character's game plan. We can look at this the other way around as well, though. We have some characters like Phoenix who have a terrible Nemesis set, very strong. And then we've got characters like Wolverine who are very good at dealing lots of damage and taking out those Nemesis minions. That can be a really good pairing if you want two X-Men to pair together. Don't tell Cyclops, but Phoenix and Wolverine actually work together really nicely. Player side schemes are more of a deck building consideration, but you kind of need to consider all the heroes at the table when you're using player side schemes for the most part. If I'm bringing Lock and Load, which brings in a weapon card, what if the other hero on the table doesn't have a weapon? Well, maybe they could bring a Sonic Rifle along, which is an aspect weapon, so I can still make use of Lock and Load. Then you have things like Superpower Training, which only function with signature upgrades. So if you're bringing Superpower Training, you might want to make sure everybody at the table actually has a good signature, identity-specific upgrade that they want to get onto the board. And then we have signature cards, which is the last big point of the video. Signature cards means either your identity card, one of your 15 or in some cases 16 identity-specific cards you get to use as well, that have really cool, unique interactions or just powerful interactions with somebody else's identity card or 15, 16 signature cards. For example, we have Rocket Raccoon, who is, yes, he likes to overkill minions, but he does that with tech cards, with his weapons. He is all about tech stuff. His alter ego interacts with it. His resource card interacts with tech. Then we have Iron Man, whose Stark Tower support card can let other players get tech cards from their discard pile back into their hand. So that can be really fun to team up those characters. Anyone who wants to use tech, Iron Man Stark Tower can be a fun combo with. Then we have Cyclops, who has his Optic Blast ability, which can target enemies with an upgrade attached. There are a few characters in the game like Valkyrie and Spider-Man who come with upgrades attached to minions. So Cyclops can get some easier blasting if someone else can attach upgrades in the right place for him. Oh, and I should also mention Cyclops is a support character. Support characters just work well with everyone, regardless of power, although they're all pretty powerful. So, you can take that with a pinch of salt, but characters like Cyclops, Storm, Cable, Doctor Strange, Scarlet Witch, things that are handing out status cards or upgrades or bonuses across the board to other people, really just tend to work well with everyone. Rogue is another character that can have really interesting pairings with actually a lot of different heroes, and I suppose I should say I'm just throwing out examples because there are too many combinations to talk about, really. But Rogue is one of some of the most interesting interactions. So one of the things that makes Rogue really interesting as a pairing for another hero is the fact that she can interact with different traits and keywords and events in different ways. So if I put Touched on another hero as Rogue, I get the Stalwart trait. That makes a lot of my events draw me a card. But if I put Touched on an aerial hero, not only do I become Stalwart, but I get to borrow the aerial trait. Now, my events, when I have the aerial trait, do extra forwarding or damage. So if I put Touched onto a hero with aerial, I'm getting both Stalwart and aerial. I'm getting double benefits, and it's very strong. Storm is, I think, the only character which can give out Retaliate to other heroes. So she obviously pairs really well with Rogue, and she can become aerial too. But Rogue also has this event called Superpower Adaptation, which she can use to take events from other players' discard piles. So some events like Scarlet, which is Chaos Magic, are extremely powerful, while Rogue can kind of take it repeatedly, which is insanely good and very useful. So having the right traits, the right ways to give out keywords, or particularly really interesting and good events can be really good for Rogue. We can look at this in a different way. Rogue also works really well with aspect and basic cards that typically need a different trait, which she can take from other heroes. So if I'm playing Rogue alongside Scarlet Witch, well, I can use Hexbolt a lot, I can use Chaos Magic, and if I'm doing that, I'm probably having the Mystic trait most turns, which means I can just include Spiritual Meditation in my Rogue deck, and I can use it basically every time, every turn. So that kind of thing can be really, really good. And she can also then start to benefit from maybe Avengers Assemble, even though she didn't start with the right trait. It's kind of fun. Another character that I've already mentioned as a support character that has interesting interactions with aspect cards and other heroes is Cable. We already touched on player side schemes briefly, but his Ultra Ego ability lets him start with any player side scheme he has in play immediately at the start of the game, which is ultra consistent. And if a character has a really vital signature upgrade, you might choose to play him with superpower training, make sure that other hero gets the upgrade turn 1, let's say Ant-Man with his helmet, and that's incredibly strong. So Cable with superpower training with a hero who has a game-changing signature upgrade is just a really good combo. Then I want to talk about what might be my favorite hero pairing, which is War Machine and Psylocke. War Machine's best card, arguably, is Shoulder Cannon, which is a 2-cost upgrade, which deals 1 damage to an enemy, and then for every ammo counter you have, you can keep readying it up. It can do 1 damage, 1 damage, 1 damage, 1 damage, and so on. Now, if the villain is confused and he has Float Like a Butterfly in play, guess what? That Shoulder Cannon is dealing 2 damage, 2 damage, 2 damage, 2 damage. But here's the thing, War Machine is a low economy hero, so it can be more beneficial for a high economy hero that can more easily afford to play the upgrade to play Float Like a Butterfly onto him, since you can play that card under any player's control. Psylocke is also the best character in the game at confusing, I would say, although Scarlet Witch, Doctor Strange, they may be in contention, but nonetheless, Psylocke is very consistent at confusing the enemy. So we can have a rich character like Psylocke play Float Like a Butterfly on War Machine, get the confusers out, then War Machine is just free to deal double damage to his heart's content, and it's incredibly fun and powerful, and I love it. So now we've basically talked about everything I want to talk about. I just want to do a little recap because this has been a long video. Main point is bring enough threat removal. So in 2-player, I'd say at least one character wants to be a pretty strong thwarter. Whether you fix that with aspects or not, that's very important. And also the speed of setup. If you're in 2-player and someone is very slow at setting up, you're going to want to make sure the other character can pick up the slack in a good way. Take these things to 4-player and you're going to need even more threat removal, and you don't want to take too many slow characters, I'll say that. Usually one is enough to carry the end game and make for a smooth victory. Then we have survivability and damage. Like I said with survivability, most characters should be able to bring enough for themselves for the most part, and it should only be when convenient and necessary that you're asking for other players to help you out. Now, if someone does say, I want to play protection deck to try and defend as many of you as possible, okay, you maybe lean a little bit less into survivability, but you need to make sure that it's happening first, because I would say the strongest protection decks are maybe only defending for 1 or 2 people, or maybe are actually focused on readying or something. So keep in mind that you're going to have someone there to actually help defend for you. If you're just asking the leadership plan to sacrifice all their allies to keep blocking for you, that's going to ruin their game plan and just be worse for the table in general. So maybe ask before you don't bring enough of your own survivability. Damage as well. Generally, most characters have enough damage, so it's not a huge worry, but definitely bringing characters that can provide different amounts of damage is typically beneficial. Control, I'll just touch on briefly. Don't bring too many stunners to the same team. Don't bring too many confusers to the same team. And the last 3 is generally just a power thing. Yeah, maybe if someone's playing a less powerful character, you want to compensate, but you don't want them to feel left behind and unuseful at the same time. So that's kind of a bit of a social, kind of a meta aspect, but I would say heroes with similar strength are more fun, typically when played together, but you don't have to do that, and there are different pros and cons to approaching it in different ways. Then we have the specifics. Pick sensible aspect choices that are going to elevate your game. Make sure your playstyles don't clash. Traits you can do a lot with. If you're avoiding doubling up on traits, each respective person can take the best cards for their trait, no problem. If you're leaning into those traits, make sure the characters you're picking, if you really want to do this, can benefit from the boosts that they respectively bring. And then signature cards, which is very specific. This is what will require the most experience and knowledge of the game, and maybe arguably skill as well. But if you can pair up signature cards from different heroes that really elevate each other, those can be some of the most fun interactions in the entire game. So that about does it for the video, but I wanted to return to the Spider-Man puzzle. If someone wants to play Spider-Man and you're looking at one of these 4 X-Men, who's going to pair best with Spider-Man? If you guys want to pause the video now, head down to the comments and say how best you think each of these pair with Spider-Man. I'd be really curious to hear it. So let's look at Spider-Man and let's break down his strengths and weaknesses and how he can kind of pair with other heroes. So he has low threat removal, and as I've said, threat removal is kind of the most important thing in my opinion. So he wants somebody that can help thwart. He's good at large attacks, so that can be beneficial, but he's not very good at kind of mid-range damage, so he might want someone who's good at doing that reliably. He has really good survivability, so he doesn't have to worry about that, and he can be good at providing survivability for characters without much of it. Maybe he can defend for them and then play backflip, or he can defend for them, take the damage, then flip down and heal with Aunt May. He likes to be attacked because he likes to draw a card from his spider sense ability, so characters with lots and lots of stun aren't really great for him. It can work out, but it's just a little obstacle that he doesn't necessarily want to have, in my opinion. It's not the end of the world. Stuns are still good. They're pretty efficient overall, but it's something to keep in mind. And then lastly, as a little bonus, he likes to attach upgrades to minions. And there's one character here that really benefits from that. So no prizes for guessing that part. So let's look at Wolverine. Wolverine has a really good forwarding card, but it needs to remove the last threat from the scheme, which can be a little bit awkward if a side scheme comes in with 7 threat. And, you know, it's a little bit inefficient then. He does have that 2 forwarding baseline, and he can ready in a lot of common builds with like Utopia and so on. So, you know, it's not the worst, but it's maybe not as good as Peter Parker would be hoping for. What Wolverine does have is he's really good at mid-range damage. He can take out minions absolutely no problem anytime. So Peter Parker does typically like that. So overall, I would say Wolverine is a decent pairing with Spider-Man, but he only really provides one of the 2 things that Spider-Man really wants. And you know, Spider-Man's survivability isn't going to benefit Wolverine too much, as Wolverine is already very good at surviving, that kind of thing. But let's look at Phoenix next. So Phoenix is really good at threat removal. She starts out free falling, which is very strong. She has a dangerous Nemesis set that asks for large attacks to deal with it. You don't want to be stuck with the Dark Phoenix for any longer than you need to. So swinging web kick can actually be a really good solution. Now, she is kind of good at mid-range damage. Once she's unleashed, she's extremely good at damage in general. But when she hasn't unleashed, she's not very good. So I've kind of put it as medium here, kind of halfway. Early game, she's not that good at it, let's face it. So that is a downside here. Now, Phoenix has low survivability, and Spider-Man isn't super excited that she has low survivability, but Phoenix is really excited that Spider-Man has a good survivability and can help her stay alive to let her do more of what Phoenix wants to do. So in that way, Phoenix is elevated by Spider-Man, so I think that makes it a really good pairing. Now, she does prevent a couple of attacks. She has a card which stuns the enemy, but only once you've unleashed. So there's only 2 cards which do it, and only once you've unleashed, which typically is later in the game. It's not the first couple of turns. So, you know, she has a couple of slightly negative points, but 4 really good points in her favor that I think make her a fantastic choice for Spider-Man to team up with. Next up, we have Cyclops, and as I kind of hinted at by the attached upgrades thing, you know, Spider-Man's spider traces he can put out there, Cyclops and Spider-Man go together really well. There are only really benefits here in my eyes, which is really good. So Cyclops is good at threat removal. He has 3 strong forwarding cards and a base forwarding of 2. And if you want to include deck building, he is kind of incentivized to take allies, which typically do bring good threat removal as well. He has really good mid-range damage. He has that Optic Blast ability, which is going to be available most turns, especially with those spider tracers. But he also has Ricochet Beam as well, which is good at kind of, you know, spacing out the damage. If you only need 3 on one target, he can typically use it to deal 3 on a different target. Now, Cyclops has kind of low survivability. Exploit weakness helps, but at the end of the day, he has 2 defense, 10 hit points, and if Ronan comes knocking, to use an extreme example, he might not be in great shape compared to, let's say, Spider-Man defending or Wolverine with his health boost and healing. And I would say, you know, if we're including deck building, Cyclops with all his allies, you know, okay, he'll have a million chump blockers available. But if Spider-Man can help him defend a bit, then his allies are going to get to do more elsewhere, which is typically beneficial, and I think it's actually a benefit. So that combos really nicely. And I've kind of talked about it because it kind of interacts with his mid-range damage and things, but the ability to have Spider-Man spider traces, it's just that fun little signature card combo that really elevates things. So Cyclops and Spider-Man are a phenomenal combo. Last but not least, we have Colossus, and this is where things are maybe not so good. Colossus's biggest weakness is, in my opinion, his low threat removal, one of the worst in the game. Guess what? Spider-Man also has some of the worst threat removal in the game baseline, so that's a really bad combination. Colossus does have really good mid-range damage, so he can typically take out minions where Spider-Man might not be able to, or might not be able to do so efficiently. But then we have the fact that Colossus also prevents attacks. One of his best cards is Steel Fist, which stuns and confuses the enemy. The confusing is fine, and hey, maybe Spider-Man can just go Alter Ego to avoid the stun and let Colossus use a stun to prevent himself losing a tough card, but it will depend on the order of operations, because Colossus likes to flip a lot. He might want to go Alter Ego as well, which will leave the stun there, possibly hitting Spider-Man next turn, making him draw one last card. You know, it isn't terrible because status cards are so good in general, but it is something that's maybe slightly more unfortunate than Colossus pairing with a different hero. So I don't love this. So in conclusion, I would say Phoenix and Cyclops are fantastic choices to pair with Spider-Man. Wolverine is okay, Colossus not so good. But this was kind of a trick question because, like I said very, very early on, you can fix most things with the aspects. So Spider-Man from Injustice, Colossus and Leadership, they'll have enough threat removal. Oh no, you still can't, maybe dodge the stun too easily with Spider-Man. Well, guess what? If someone plays Under Surveillance, which is a Justice card which makes the main scheme safer, it increases the threat threshold. With that Confuse especially, they can both probably go Alter Ego very, very safely. That's really good, and it's one of the strengths of this game that if you have the right deck building know-how and cards and experience, you can basically make anyone work really well with anyone. There are some maybe small exceptions. Some of the low forwarding characters that maybe lack a little in the power in terms of economy and ability to afford to do things as well, maybe aren't going to be the greatest pairing to take up against the hardest expert scenarios, but hey, I'm sure a lot of them are actually possible. You just might have to try a lot harder and maybe make a few attempts. So yeah, that about does it. Hopefully this has helped you guys pair up heroes in multiplayer. Yes, I focus a little bit more on 2-player, but I think that's a lot more common than 3 and 4-player, and most of these principles still apply to 3 and 4-player. It actually makes, 3 and 4 players more forgiving. The other thing I'd like to say is, if you guys would be so kind, if you want to pair up the like button with a comment, that would be an amazing combination. If you guys aren't subscribed, maybe we could have a good team up card together if, you try hitting that. It's up to you guys, but I just appreciate you being here. This has been amazing. The next video in this little mini series I've been doing of pairing up aspects and heroes and rating them is I'm going to try and rate every hero's best pairings with other heroes. And I don't mean just pairing everybody with Doctor Strange. It's not going to be going for power, just like this video wasn't going for power. Which heroes benefit the most from being paired with each other? So keep an eye out for that. That'll be probably, I don't know, a month or two. I don't really know. I've got a lot of villain stuff coming up. So keep an eye out for that in the next month or two, and feel free to check out some of the links below. Thank you so much, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye.